This paper sets out to consider whether or not Deception Island does offer a peculiar case for investigation. It stems from a personal fascination with the island, which began when I read my father's account of his time there. He describes the melancholy sense of abandonment imbued by the ruined whaling station, but appreciates the colour of the place and the pleasure of an evening spent at the Chilean base. Later, researching the island in the Archives Office of the British Antarctic Survey, I developed an altogether darker sense of the place. I was reading 2 tattered and weather-worn journals left behind when the base was abandoned, picked up by a US tourist in 1972 and sent on to the British Antarctic Survey, totally unlike the official base journals in style. Certain details lodged in my mind. The births and deaths at sea of Puta's 13 children, for example, recorded like a newspaper announcement. It wasn't immediately obvious that Puta, the whore, was one of the huskies, and the puppies had been drowned. Or the enigmatic note about Farrant, who could not find any water, so was going to take a hole down to the beach, fill it, and dig another one alongside it. As the day begins with reference to the men being either asleep or drunk, and that nothing ever happens worth recording, the comment about transporting a hole takes on the resonance of a symbol for existential crisis in the face of meaningless activity. Add to this black and white images of the ruined whaling station. And of life carried on or in or near the ruins. And there is a powerful sense of the uncanny, of something fearful hidden just out of sight amongst the whalebones and detritus. To what extent was this impression of deception the creation of my imagination, or was there something particular about it, to merit being considered one of the worser postings, as the base leader suggested in the introduction to the journal for 1959? And if so, why was this the case? What I am presenting today is an initial speculative response. The physical archives have been closed for the last few months, even to the archivists. However, I'm very grateful to Yayan and Kevin at the British Antarctic Survey, who recently sent me what material they could when they could return to the archives. The mock announcement about Puta's puppies raises the spectre of death and violence, which chimes with the history of sealing and whaling on the island. Is it chance alone that the only suicide amongst British personnel took place on Deception? The base journal for 1954 opens with the arrival of the ship Biscoe and the death of A.H. Farrant. Telegrams between Deception and Stanley on the 18th at 9 a.m. clarify that Farrant shot himself through the head and died instantaneously. The verdict was suicide whilst of unsound mind, and the governor reported that his death was a complete mystery. There are a few discordant notes, however, in what I've seen so far. A question from Deception in a telegram later that day suggests an element of uncertainty about the propriety of churchyard burial for a man who had killed himself, and the choice of a site in the corner of the Whalers' Cemetery seems to acknowledge this. It also marks Farrant as something of an outsider. Telegrams in the archive show that he'd resigned as base leader in March 1953, apparently because of trouble between himself and some of the other men. His resignation was not accepted. Some of the oral records from men who worked on Deception on or around that time identify him as something of an outsider. He was older than the other men and not part of the tight-knit group making up the rest of the team. In addition, he was responsible for the generators, which often failed, a problem which wasn't confined to Deception. A number of people mentioned Farrant's conscientious approach, and before he died, he polished all the pipes, painted the floor of the diesel room, and as the boat came in to relieve him, he shot himself. In this version of the story, leaving seems to be a worse option than staying on. The few clues provided by his application form suggest that his alienation from others on base in Deception was not a first occurrence. He was sacked from his position as progress clerk in a thermometer factory as a result of a difference of opinion with one of the directors, and there were 2 patches of unemployment before his stint of national service with the Navy. He did not have an established place to return to. Recruitment for the Antarctic in these early days was not from a pool of vast numbers of applicants, and there was clearly an occasional issue with the men selected. The base diary for Deception in 1945 records an instance of a man employed to overwinter in the Antarctic, despite tobacco poisoning and ongoing problems caused by being gassed during the war. There is also a reference to the need to separate two men for the sake of their happiness and the smooth running of Base A. These instances of possible psychological or medical unsuitability are specific to Deception, but there are documents which suggest that there was a similar problem, though without the tragic ending, in the early days at Halley. The psychological report from there in 1959 makes it clear that the challenges of overwintering on a static base through the Antarctic winter in particular require a basic adaptability in a person, not so much to the environmental but to the psychological conditions, and a capacity to modify speech and behaviour in such a way which would avoid offence to others in the group. The found journals record the camaraderie, the leg pulling, the humour which sustains members of a group, but which could isolate and possibly wound the outsider. This photograph, which might include Farrant, I haven't been able to double check, shows three men looking directly at the photographer, smiling with glints in their eyes, and another two looking past him in entirely different directions. Even though 1959 was described by the base leader as possibly the happiest in the history of Deception, with no friction and no one on the outside, there is always the possibility of discord. There are 168 pages in the informal record compared to 11 pages of the official one. It's a shared effort, full of ribald remarks, insults and verbal riffs on various themes to counteract the monotony of the days. Base personnel as members of Parliament, as the Prophet and Moses, as midwives, adventurers and layabouts. It requires inclusion. The size and physical geography of Deception also enabled positive activities. The close proximity of the Argentine and Chilean bases allowed for frequent exchanges. There was a ski slope by the hut, and in the summer months ships visited the harbour, and there were sheltered waters for boating and fishing. There was a penguin colony, and creatures to observe and to shoot. You needed to enjoy the outside life to enjoy these activities, and Farrant, according to some of his colleagues, was not in this sense an outside man. Even the ruins, which exercised such a powerful influence on my imagination, allowed for constructive action, creative recycling of materials for carpentry, plumbing and haulage projects, as well as offering space to house a big piglet to fatten up for winter. That same physical geography and the material remains on the island also imbue it with its symbolic resonance, its black volcanic sand, its ground resistant to human shaping. We're at the side of Farrant's grave again, as the men tried to pickaxe a hole deep enough to bury him. It was a difficult hole to dig. Between unloading stores and servicing the No. 1 engine, the men took turns. It was a communal effort. They managed 4 feet in 3 days and piled 2 foot of rocks on top of the grave after the burial. Jim Shirtcliffe describes the tension felt on base after Farrant's death, combining the account of an incident where all the men were reprimanded by the base leader with an explanation of why Farrant's grave was so hard to dig. The volcanic sand is very porous, and as soon as you make a dent in the surface, water runs in and freezes. To avoid the kind of painstaking picking away at the ground experienced when digging Farrant's grave, they discharged an explosive to make a hole for an aerial mast, and Shirtcliffe surmised that the base leader had immediately feared the worst. The volcanic nature of the island eventually erupted into life in 1967 and 1969, leading to the desertion of the British base and the erasure of most of the graves in the cemetery, including Farrant's. Perhaps then, despite, or maybe because of, its geographic specificity, Deception is not particular in the way I first thought. Working there is not the graveyard shift. Farrant's story illustrates the kind of difficulties associated with a static base in Antarctica more generally, the lassitude and monotony of the winter darkness, the tensions which can arise from a small group of men living confined in close quarters. Deception perhaps did not deserve the reputation attributed to it by Hodgkinson in 1959. However, Its black volcanic sands, its gleaming basalt, counters the trope of Antarctic whiteness, the tendency referred to by Alessandro Antonello to treat Antarctica generically. It highlights the way in which a sense of place is created out of relationship between the ground and the people living on it, something experiential, something which exists in narrative, something remembered, imagined, passed on.